everyone. Welcome. We're here at the Center for Reconciliation. My name is Sean Delberty. I'm the Senior Advisor to Mayor Jorge Elorza. Today we're coming to you to announce a very beautiful announcement. But first, before we get into any of that, I want to introduce to you Mr. Marco McCloud, the Associate Director of the Center for Reconciliation. Marco.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor and pleasure to be here as not only the Center for Reconciliation, but the city and indeed the state is preparing to launch on a new path, a new journey forward. Not only for highlighting the history, the struggle, the dreams, the beauty of the African American community here, but for the broader Rhode Island community, we begin to dream together and imagine a different city, a freer space, a progression that will lead the state. I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the distinguished members who are part of the leadership here at the Center. Bishop Right Reverend Nicholas Nyson, standing there in the back. Dr. Robert McCloud, Judge Edward Clifton, my Communications Director, Christian Knudsen Bro. And I would be remiss if I did not mention our distinguished Executive Director, Ms. Deborah Sharp. Thank you all.
Thank you for that, Marco. Now we're going to bring to you our very own Mayor of Providence, Mr. Honorable, my Mayor, Jorge Elorza. Mayor.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. I also want to recognize, as Marco just mentioned, the Center for Reconciliation. You know, as we engage in another step of this process, I can't think of a better place to have this announcement. And so to Marco and the entire team here at the Center, thank you for having us and for hosting us today. I also want to recognize Sean Delberty Speaks. She, as a senior advisor on my team, has been leading an initiative to bring together voices in the Black community and make sure that they're at the center of decision-making in the city of Providence. I'll speak a little bit more about that in just a second, but thank you, Sean Del. As I mentioned, I want to recognize Marco Williams. Thank you for hosting us and having us here today, and also participating in the same group that I just referenced. I want to recognize two very important people as part of this process. Mr. Keith Stokes and his wife, Sunny Stokes. They have been the leads in terms of the researchers getting us to this point. They have been working extremely hard to put together this incredible report, over 200 pages, just text, and footnotes takes us into several hundred more. Truly an incredible lift, incredible job, and I thank you all for what you've done. I want to recognize B.J. Murray. B.J. Murray is also a leader and a member of the African American Ambassador Group that I've been referencing. She brings a very powerful voice to every day's discussion. Someone whose opinions carry a great deal of weight. And I really appreciate your presence and your support here today. Thank you so much, B.J. And someone who needs no introduction, Raymond Tupac Watson. He's also a member of the larger group, but in particular has been working with BJ as part of the truth-telling subgroup, and someone whose voice carries a great deal of weight as well, and it's just an incredible, young, about my age, I guess not so young anymore, voice in our community, but at least I appreciate you. Great to welcome us. Last but not least, I want to recognize our man in the back, Bishop Jeffrey Williams, who has been the the facilitator of many of these conversations, brings people to the table, keeps people at the table, and it has just been, it's really guiding voice throughout this entire process. Appreciate you deeply, Bishop. And then last but not least, a great, great friend of mine and of the community, Judge Ed Clifton. Now you, your family, you are, it's often said that we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And you and your cohort, you all have carried the baton for a great deal of time. And I think that everyone who carries the baton, it's their hope that they hand it off in a better position to those who come next. And you and those around you, something else. So thank you, Judge. So, they say that there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. For our country and our community, examining the centuries of injustices committed against Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, and reconciling those truths are long overdue. I mean, let's face it. Issues of racism have been at the core of this country's founding. They were part of the Great Compromise during the Constitution. 40 years later is the issue during the Missouri Compromise. Just shy of 40 years after that, it was the defining issue as the nation split of the passing of the Kansas Act. And then, of course, 40 years after that, it tore our country apart in a civil war. There was progress for a brief, perhaps 12 years, but then once again, our country split back into the Jim Crow discrimination that we have still not fully overcome. There was perhaps some progress as tensions boiled over during the 1960s, but still we're seeing that the lingering effects of the past continue to shape the present in a way that they have never been fully reconciled and have never been fully addressed. I mean, let's face it. We are at a point right now in our history where we can take the same approach that we've always taken and skirt the issue, sidestep the issue. But look at where it's gotten us. We're living in a moment right now where perhaps the racial tensions are as challenged and as fraught as they've been in 40, 50, maybe 60 years. And so what we've chosen to do as an entire community here in Providence is let's confront it directly. What a thought. And these issues that have been so divisive in the past, we believe don't necessarily have to be divisive in the future. We all believe that diversity is our strength. So let's live by those words. Let's come together. Let's understand some undeniable and fundamental truths about our own community, even if they're challenging, even if they're difficult to absorb. Let's engage with them. Let's use them to challenge ourselves and do it collectively as a community so that as we go through this process, we will emerge a much more united and together community. And that's exactly what we're doing here in Providence. So just several months ago, we launched the truth-telling, racial reconciliation, and municipal reparations process. Now these are 3 separate phases. Every single one of these phases is as important as the other. But the beauty is when they all come together. So what we're here to announce is, in effect, the completion of the first phase of that work, which is the truth-telling part of it. But one phase shades into the next. After the truth-telling phase, we're going to launch the reconciliation phase. Now, Keith, Sonny, and all the researchers, they put together this marvelous piece of scholarship and research. However, it is still a very, very dense report. And what we want to do over the coming weeks is to engage with the community so that many of the deep truths inside of this report, they become fingertip knowledge for all of us throughout the community. And through disseminating this information, we will begin in earnest this reconciliation process. Because I believe that fundamentally, when people read the report and engage with the information and the truths within it, when people will recognize the injustice, and we all have a moral instinct inside of us. When we recognize that people have been treated so unjustly and unfairly, we want to step up and do something about it. We want to be part of the solution. And we're going to offer avenues to the entire community to come in, to be allies, to join us in this endless, seemingly endless fight to make sure that we reconcile our differences across races. And then, once we're done with the reconciliation phase, which is a continuous process, then we will launch the reparations phase. And that's an opportunity for all of us as a community to perhaps not make amends for all of the injustices of the past, but it goes a long way when you see, when the community sees that we are making efforts and strides and moving in the right direction, but also hopefully building momentum for other levels of government and for other institutions in our society to also be part of reconciliation and reparations. So the broad strokes, that's what brings us here today, and that's what's going to guide us going forward. What began as a weekly discussion, perhaps 10 months ago, where we started to explore the disproportionate impact that COVID was having in our community. That conversation changed soon after the George Floyd murder. At that point, we could not turn away and we could not deny that the Black community has been systematically and indiscriminately put down, shoved down, and kept down. And so the conversations pivoted from COVID specifically to broader issues of structural racism and anti-Blackness that exist in our community. So we've been meeting for the past 10 months, every single Thursday at 10 a.m. for an hour and a half. We've had hundreds of people participate, and folks keep coming back. In effect, what we've done is we've elevated and we've amplified the voices of our own Black community so that they're guiding the priorities of the city and they are setting the agenda. Well, when we gave voice to our Black community, they asked us to take on issues of the state's name. They've asked us to take on issues of structural racism. They've asked us to take on issues that have brought us to this point. And I know that Providence is not alone in going down this road. There are other cities in the United States that have taken certain aspects of this work and engaged in their own communities. Asheville, Evanston, and a slow but growing list of cities are taking this on as well. However, there is no city in the United States that has engaged in this work as deeply and as comprehensively as our community has right here in Providence. This truth-telling phase is especially important because it builds that mutual understanding. Because if we really want to make the most out of this George Floyd moment, then we got to go to the root. We got to go to the source because the wounds that run deep. And that's exactly what this truth-telling phase begins. The contents of this truth-telling document, frankly, should not surprise anyone. Here, Keith and his team have clearly laid out the centuries of discrimination and disinvestment that are the root causes of systemic inequities that persist to this day. And what's so incredible about this document is that it reminds us that history is not a thing of the past, but rather history is something that actively shapes the present. And we're engaging with people whose own families, who have themselves personally been touched, been influenced, and been hurt by these truths. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we know, are more likely to live in poverty. Even today, the median wealth for Black households is less than 10% of the national average for white families. And more than a quarter of American Indians, of the American Indian population, live in poverty, more than double the national average. Children growing up in poverty are more likely to have health problems, less likely to graduate high school or go to college, and they're more likely to commit street crime. Here in the United States, the wealthiest nation in the world, far too many hold a deep-rooted belief that poor people are mostly to blame for their poverty, instead of recognizing the nearly insurmountable challenges that these communities face to change their station. As this document shows, the challenges facing the BIPOC community did not end after genocide, did not end after the abolition of slavery, and did not change even after the seismic shifts in our society after the civil rights era. Government-sanctioned policies consistently displaced and disenfranchised minority communities and exacerbated poverty and wealth inequality. Here in Providence, city officials bulldozed black neighborhoods to make way for highways, for parks, and for segregated housing. Despite the integration of public schools in 1866 and the reduced neighborhood segregation through busing and student integration policies of the 1960s and 70s, the data shows that our public schools are still just as segregated today as they were back then, and frankly, they're trending in the wrong direction. In the year 2000, just over a third of the district's 55 schools at the time were at least 90% minority. So a third of the schools were 90% minority 20 years ago. 15 years later, just a few years ago, that one-third became 3/4. 74% of schools in Providence were 90% non-white. The biggest jump in non-white schools in any district in the nation. Another major problem is the continuing underrepresentation of minority teachers in our school system. In 1975, there were 88 black teachers, comprising 7% of the total. Today, it's 20%. Sure, there's been an improvement, but one that still does not adequately account for our student population. These policies not only influence wealth and education achievement, but our very health as well. The ongoing global pandemic has disproportionately impacted the BIPOC community. Black and African Americans have an infection rate that is about five times that of the white community. As mayor, it is my top priority to ensure that all of our residents are enabled to succeed, and I will use the powers of my office to ensure that these disparities are indeed addressed. As I mentioned, the next step in this process is to highlight the inequalities, the discrimination, and frankly, the injustice, and do what we can to correct as much as we can these harms from the past. Today, the City of Providence will be releasing an RFP, a request for proposals, to have a facilitator engage our community and collect their feedback through the reconciliation process. To help this initiative, the city has received a generous grant of $100,000 from the Nellie Mae Foundation that is committed to fighting racial injustice. I look forward to working with the broader community to make sure that we are all a part of this reconciliation process. We did not get here by the single act of one individual. These are systemic, these are structural issues. The only way we can turn this around is also by the systemic, the structural involvement of every single one of us, so that it's embedded into the work so that anti-racism is embedded into the very work that we do throughout our community and throughout our society. Together, Providence is showing a new way around racial differences, and we're making our differences actually what brings us together. So I'm heartened by all of the amazing leaders that have brought us to this point, and I look forward to engaging in this next step, the truth-telling, racial reconciliations, and municipal reparations process. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mayor. We look forward to the next chapter of this journey. Next, I'm going to bring to you Mr. Keith Stokes from the 1696 Heritage Group. Vice President Keith Stokes, welcome.
Thank you, Sean Delberty. I first want to recognize Mayor Elorza and his African American Advisory Commission. Never in my life have I seen this level of vision, leadership, passion around the issue of reconciliation reparations, and most importantly today, the beginning of the truth of the history of African heritage, people of color, and indigenous people in this state. This is a vision that is going to lead to a process that's going to engage people of color, particularly young people of color, to be able to identify their history, and most importantly, their birthright to succeed in this city and in this state. Now, this report, which is a beginning of a process, I believe as the lead researcher and author, is mostly important to the fact that it offers close to 700 primary, secondary source footnotes, which will provide an opportunity for future scholars and future readers to take this data, to take these historical truths, and build that into the next level of public interpretation, presentations, programs, and most importantly, identity building within our communities of color. And there's some young leaders right here, from Marco to Ray to Sean Delberty, who I hope pick up this mantle and lead this effort going forward. Now, it's impossible for me to go through 400 years of history in about 5 minutes, so read the report. But what I will do is give you some of the highlights of the findings between 1620 and 2020. America's first pandemic, the Great Dying between 1619 and 1919, it wiped out close to 90% of the indigenous population from Maine to Cape Cod. So well before the European settlement and colonization of what we call today New England, Boston, Providence, Newport, and Haven, well before that, many of the indigenous men, women, and children died because there was no modern-day health system or technological systems to support them to deal with these newly arriving colonizers who brought with them not only their sense of land, but also disease. So as today we wrestle with this pandemic called COVID, think what it would have been like for the indigenous men, women, and children that had no natural resistance and no medical capability to deal with the first American pandemic, which we call the Great Dying. That Great Dying would set the stage for a fast-tracking of colonization, land expansion, and development, unlike any of the time in the history of America. Between 1709 and 1807, Rhode Island merchants, led by Providence, Newport, and Bristol, were responsible for at least 934 documented slave voyages that went from Rhode Island to West Africa, to the West Indies, and back to Rhode Island. We now know from documentation, and this report includes a documentation of every ship, and as much information as far as the number of Africans who were transported, and other products and goods, and most importantly, those owners of the vessels that were some of the leading families of Providence, Bristol, and Newport. During that 100-year period of time, which scholars at the time would call our golden age, transported, we believe, at least 150,000 African men, women, and children. In Rhode Island's case, mostly children, lodging to the West Indies, but eventually back to Rhode Island. The detribalization of the indigenous people, mostly represented by the Narragansett tribe, has been a constant challenge over 400 years. And in fact, if history can teach us anything, the Narragansett tribe of Rhode Island may be some of the most resilient people who have ever walked the earth. Despite the best efforts of Rhode Island governments to disband the tribe and deny their selfhood, the Narragansetts have maintained their identity as the first people of Rhode Island, along with a number of other indigenous tribes. It's also important to recognize that for the first 350 years of our state's history, 90% of the non-white population were African heritage people. Not Latino, not Asian, not seniors, not gays, but African heritage. So when we talk in terms of racialized discrimination, violence, neighborhood destruction, lack of access to basic housing, employment, livelihood, it is almost exclusively dedicated and focused upon African heritage people. And that's an incredibly important fact to understand, because many of us today who benefit from the social justice and equal rights and civil rights laws and policies, it all came on the backs and the shoulders that we stand on of African heritage men, women, and children. During the 20th century, Providence and Rhode Island African heritage residents lived in what we call a Jim Crow tradition. The extraordinary circumstances where if you happen to be black in Providence in 1950, the opportunities for safe housing, a quality job, or a quality education was far and few between, as compared to if you had lived in Mississippi, or South Carolina, or Virginia. While those southern states in the 20th century had Jim Crow laws, Rhode Island government, municipal government, private business practices consistently maintained Jim Crow traditions. Publicly sanctioned urban redevelopment, urban renewal programs in the mid-20th century were specifically targeted to largely African heritage and limited income communities. The level of deconstruction and disruption was nearly complete. In those communities today, which are recognized as Fox Point, College Hill, Mount Hope, Lippin Hill, West Elmwood, Upper South Providence, were almost completely depopulated of its largely historic African heritage and other people of color and limited working people. And I want to be fair, this was not only going on in Providence, Rhode Island, it was going on across the country. And it would be the great 20th century author James Baldwin would coin the term, it's not urban renewal, it's Negro removal. And the extraordinary circumstance of Negro removal in 20th century Providence had as much of a negative impact on the very existence of African heritage people as compared to enslavement a century and a half before. And then the final point, which I think is one of the most important points of the study, a zip code address should not determine a child's access to quality education. The educational achievement gaps between urban students and suburban students, and the achievement gaps between African heritage and now Latino and white students may well be one of the most important civil rights issues in the 21st century. So, this study is a starting point. It begins the process of engaging community organizations such as the Reconciliation Center and many others. It's led by the interpretation of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, because many of the collections that you see here today come from these great historical institutions that we have within this city and in this state. And they're waiting for scholars, they're waiting for the next generation of leaders to take this report, to take the data, engage these societies, and bring these stories and this truth to the larger public. So it's been an honor to be a part of this process, the privilege. My kids are 9th generation Rhode Islanders, and I thought I knew most, and this was a learning and a painful learning experience for my own self. But I'm excited of the vision going forward, led by the mayor and the African American Advisory Committee. The reconciliation process will be unlike anything else. And what's most important about the process is it's open to all. It's available to all, so that all of us have the opportunity to learn together and build a better city, a better state, and a better nation for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, nation origin, sexual orientation, an opportunity for all of us to benefit. So again, thank you, Mayor, and we look forward to this next great step. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stokes. It has been an honor working with you and your wife, Sony. I am going to be so honest, I've learned more in the past 10 months than I've ever learned in my life. So I'm excited about this reconciliation document to be launched with the city. Next, we're bringing to you Ms. B.J. Murray. She is an ambassador of the Truth Telling and Reconciliation. She's a subgroup member of that group. Ms. B.J.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for inviting us here today. And thank you for all the work you've done. And I want to thank all of my colleagues on this committee. We've worked hard over these last few months. I have to say, as an individual who was growing up in the 50s and the 60s, this piece of work is extremely important to me because I have seen how past feuds and past history has shaped the policies and the attitudes that still are with us today and still affect families, BIPOC families, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It really affects everyone. So why are we here? We're here because if we don't look at the past, if we don't call out our history and understand it, history has shown that we will repeat it. And we have repeated some of these wrongs for too long. Reconciliation is not to point fingers, but it is to reconcile wrongs. It is to make sure that we truly understand and truly address and balance the playing field. Reparations is just an extension of action of the reconciliation. It's funny, some people think that reconciliation and reparations is a zero-sum game. That someone has to lose for someone to be reconciled. I would say to you that as an American, I feel that I am part of the whole. And that includes everyone. When I say community, that includes absolutely everyone. When I talk about diversity, that includes absolutely everyone. And when everyone is not able for any reason to fire at full capacity, the opportunity to, we all lose. So reconciliation and the resulting reparations really is for everyone's benefit. It is for everyone to gain from. We make little ground if we do not recognize that all of us do not have the opportunity to participate fully. So coming from reconciliation and actually reconciling, identifying the places where we need to reconcile, and then subsequent reparations, actually putting that into action, is a way of helping clean the slate to move forward. To say that we are going to work as a whole. And for a person who has gone through, again, the Jim Crow era, a lot of discrimination, and it still continues today, I absolutely applaud this historical moment. And I'm going to encourage everyone, as this is rolled out, everyone in the community, and again, the community is every single person, to engage with us, to become part of this process, because it is to your personal benefit, no matter who you are, for this to work. Thank you.
It's been an honor to work with you as well. Your knowledge is immensible. I love just hearing her talk and hearing her wisdom as she engages us all in the group and in this process. So I honor you. Next, I'm going to introduce to you my friend, Chief Raymond Watson, who is also a member of the Truth Telling subgroup. Ray?
Magpapangulini Tupac, Watson. Shasik, Bobokanoke Ka Nahiganses, Nimiwa, Niskwa Anatabak Ka Iniski Tampawa, Muni Mosquito Ka Akoni. Good morning, friends. How are you doing? Welcome to the lands of the Shasik, of the Pokanoket and Nahigantic people, the original people. These are our lands and we are still here. But unto you we say, good medicine and peace be unto you all. I'm very honored to be here today, to have been invited to share some remarks. First of all, much respect to Mayor Elorza, the African American Heritage Group, 1696 Heritage Group. Personally, I say, for legitimizing my story. And I'll take a moment just to share my story. When Keith speaks about the illegally tribalization of the Narragansett Indian tribe in 1881, what he's speaking about is my fourth great-grandfather, Bristol Michael, who was one of the last Narragansett chiefs to be forced to sign off on the land. They actually caught him coming out of a pub when he was intoxicated and got the signature that way. And even when they got before the commission and contested it, the state of Rhode Island didn't want to hear it. So that was part of my story that he shared. When he spoke about what happened to the Lippet Hill and the Mount Hope and the Fox Point neighborhoods, those are all neighborhoods that I've grown up in and my family has grown up in. Once again, going back to Chiefs, my uncle, Chief Sunset, lived right in Lippet Hill. He was one of the last full-blood chiefs. When the tribe down in South County was reestablishing themselves in the early 1900s, Chief Pine Tree and Princess Minnetonka came up and spoke to my uncle, right up this hill, where now MLK Elementary and University Heights are. So once again, my story being told. And when you talk about the discrimination against African heritage people, my father's people moved up here in the early 1900s from Atlanta. And went through all of that, grew up in the Chaptown housing projects, met my mother over in Mount Hope, and I was the product out of that. And once again, when Keith talks about the discrimination and the oppression that was going on, these are stories that I remember hearing growing up from my family members who had gone through it. Yet when you go out into the public and try to share this with people who don't know, you're put in a position to have to legitimize and prove to people what you know happened to you. And what does that do to you mentally and spiritually when people who aren't from these lands, as long as you've been here, are questioning whether you're telling your own truth? What this report does today is put all of that nonsense discussion to rest. With this report, I don't feel like I'm going to have to go out and prove what happened to me anymore. What happened to my family, what happened to my friends. We don't need to do that anymore. Because Mayor Elorza was bold enough and had enough leadership to press this issue, because we had members from our community who were committed to making sure that this issue was brought to light, because we had experts from our community who had the skill set to be able to put it together. So once again, I just want to thank you all, because for me, 5-10 years ago, trying to find a new way of life, this is your story and you should know it. This isn't the Black community story. This isn't the Indian community story. This is Rhode Island's story. And we either have to be upset with ourselves as Rhode Islanders that this is our story, or we have to be proud that we have a narrative that, in my opinion, is second to none in this world. So with that being said, I will leave you simply with these very, very simple words, original language of this very lands that we're in. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope as you all read this document, you'll find out ways to include yourself in the change that's going to go on, so that in the future, I will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ray. We appreciate you and all that you've brought to this group and this work. Your knowledge has been extremely helpful to us. So as we wrap up, I'm going to bring back to you Mayor Jorge Elorza. Mayor.
So I want to thank all of the members of the panel, everyone who spoke today. And each of them bring a unique powerful perspective to this work. And you add it all up, and that's where the beauty is. So over the coming weeks and months, and frankly even years, I look forward to doing this work together with every single one of you. That's it for the speaking program. We'll take some questions.
Mayor, going from this inward look with people from the community, and now you're going to the RFP, would be some outside group that comes in, what, takes this material and just suggests what to do next? Or?
That's pretty much it right there. So so we put in RFP, and we know that the reconciliation process isn't something that just happens naturally on its own. It has to be guided, it has to be facilitated. And as a committee, we thought through a lot of different ways to do it. We even thought through doing it internally. But it was a suggestion from one of the participants to, you know what, let's open this up and let's see what kind of ideas come out there. You know, there are national groups that do this work that bring a great deal of expertise. So we're encouraging everyone, both locally and nationally, to submit a proposal, and we will be reviewing this proposal, and whoever has the best plan, the best idea for how to engage the group internally, and also engage the outside group, to engage in these important and sometimes difficult conversations, that's the one that we'll go with.
And what's that goal? What are they going to be working with?
So it's a process of reconciliation. So, you know, we're not the only ones who have ever gone through this. Many countries have gone through it, many communities have gone through it. So there are experiences for us to learn from. And so the end goal of this, what I think we collectively will want to see, is that we emerge on the other side with a better understanding of our own history. Many things happen right here in our own city that we're just not aware of. So generally, I'd like for the insights of this report to be better absorbed into our own community and our own society. And I believe that naturally from that, the more they're deeply understood and absorbed throughout society, the more people will want to be a part of the solution. And when you have a solutions orientation, it brings people together. We all understand that the solutions are much bigger than any one individual. We got to work in partnership. We got to work with different communities. We got to work with different institutions, with other levels of government. We want to bring people together to brainstorm and strategize. How do we best do right by some of the terrible things that have happened in the past? And at the end of this reconciliation process, I absolutely believe that we will have a much more united, a much more together community. And then that will set the stage for the third phase of this process, which is the municipal reparations.
And what are you currently envisioning, Mayor, now that we're a number of months into this process? How could those reparations take shape? What form?
I think it runs again. It can be anything and anything. And I want to be careful, and I want to be sure to not set any limitations on what the community recommends as the best way to do reparations. And so in the coming months or so, I plan on designating a committee. And this committee will be tasked with making recommendations to the city, not just to me, but to the city, on what the appropriate form of reparations are. Understanding that we are just one city, and we cannot undo all of the injustices of the past. We cannot right all of those wrongs. But what we can do is that we can get the ball rolling. We know that there's been a bill in Congress that has been proposed for many, many years around studying reparations. It's never made it out of committee, it's never made it anywhere. But by establishing this proof point, that you can not only go through this process, but actually lead to an end result that brings people together and heals the entire community, as EJ mentioned. You know, I expect that this is going to continue to move the ball forward so that it bubbles up to higher levels of society. So it's not confined to the work that we're doing here in Providence, but we're seeing other institutions in our city, perhaps state government, and then eventually perhaps the entire federal government take this on as a needed reform. So there are no limits on how, what shape it can take, But certainly what we want to do is we want to be national leaders to push this conversation forward so that eventually it's taken up by every institution and level of government in our country.
But do you envision direct monetary payments of some kind? Because I think that's where some other city leaders are skeptical about your initiative.
So I'm not ruling anything out, but at the same time, I'm also I'm going into this with eyes wide open and very practical about this. And the kind of resources that it would take to right the wrongs of the past are astronomical. Astronomical. Something that no city can afford, and that it would have to come from the federal government. And so there are limitations to what we can do. But the fact that there are limitations doesn't mean that we can't move the ball forward significantly. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to move the ball forward significantly. And that's what this effort is all about. Even if we can't get all the way home, I'm determined, as we have already done, to continue to move forward, not just in the conversation, but in the actual tasks and in the work. And I think that through that, we can encourage and inspire other levels of government and other institutions to take this on as well.
To go off of that, is the grant, this $100,000 grant, it's great news, is it enough? What does that cover typically? What does that really do?
So this helps us with facilitation for the reconciliation process. So we will hire some facilitators, we'll hire some consultants, and they'll help bring people together. So they'll shape what that reconciliation process looks like. So it could be anything from community conversations, it could be sort of redrafting portions of this report so that they're more digestible to other people in the community, say perhaps to younger folks, teenagers and children. It could be guest speakers that come in from throughout the country and guide conversations. It could be any number of those things, and I'm open to all of those. This grant is going to help us hire the facilitators that will design and help us execute that plan to bring people together.
So you mentioned some of those concrete examples. Is this something too that, we've heard talk about putting this in schools and starting to teach this in curriculums? What does that look like here on Providence?
Sure, that's something that we certainly hope will be part of this, and that I would have to imagine that there'll be a lot of interest by educators in incorporating this in whole or in part into the curriculum. There's already a growing interest in teaching our kids their own history, teaching them their own history, so that they're just more engaged and more interested in it. I know myself, I went through public schools here. I knew nothing about the Braceros farm worker program until I went to college and I took a special class in this. These are part of our own history. It's part of American history. This should be taught to all children. And just the same, there are so many gems and jewels and insights in this report that we want to be fingertip knowledge for all our community, including our kids in our schools. And it's very empowering, and Keith says this so well. When we talk about, in broad strokes, when we talk about African American history in our schools, we talk about slavery and we talk about the struggles of the civil rights. The Civil War, and then the Civil Rights era. There is so much more to African American history than just those things. And as Keith mentioned, it's important to continue to show our young people that the history of the Black community in our country is not the history of slavery, it's not the history of discrimination. It's the history of the Black community overcoming all of those hurdles and all of those barriers. And there's certain strength and power in that. And certainly those are all parts of the story here that and what we want to accomplish through this report. Any other questions?
On another subject.
All right, we'll take those one off. Thank you so much, everyone.